How Mainstream Economists Hate Their Children's Futures. By C. Stevens. Over centuries, the so-called upper class in Britain were unproductive landowners, that lived off the taxes of the workers that produced food on their land. Being unproductive and indolent in Britain was not a badge of deep shame, but to the contrary, was regarded as a badge of honor. Heredity, privilege, and the ownership of land enabled the extraction of monopoly profits from the productive working class. Monopoly profits are the opposite of free market capitalism. This parasitic so-called upper class embodies feudalism that was thrown off by the new republic, the capitalist United States, with its previous debt-free greenbacks that were issued by President Lincoln. Today, however, there is a new anti-free market, anti-capitalist, parasitic class that are pilfering and destroying the productive laboring class. These are the bankers, that are given monopoly rights by government to create debt in an economy, and skim interest profits on every dollar borrowed by business and families. Worse, these same bankers, are able to pyramid debt upon debt in an economy through compound debt growth, decade after decade, extracting larger and larger profits from the productive wealth creating class, while simultaneously increasing costs and prices of everything as a result of ever-escalating interest burden. Unfortunately, our ordinary brain-dead neoclassical economist is unable to call out this banker neo-feudalism by bankers, because they still believe the fiction that bankers simply lend deposits. We will debunk this foundational fiction of mainstream economics shortly. What country, on average, has the richest citizens in the world? If you listen to ordinary, mainstream, neoclassical economists, you would be in little doubt. Surely it would be a free market economy like the United States. But you would be wrong. The free market United States rates very, very badly in median wealth per head, at a miserable 24th in the world. With wealth of a pitiful $56,000. This compares to the world-leading nation, a tiny socially progressive Scandinavian country that has median per capita wealth that is 8 times greater, with over $449,000. Which country? The answer is Iceland. Surprised? Switzerland is second. Maybe mainstream Yale's and Harvard economists don't bother to look at other countries. Don't expect to hear the truth from the idiot corporate media that is beholden to bank creditors. So you're a member of the millennial generation or even younger. On average, you are destined to live worse than your parents. Many will live much, much worse than baby boomers, despite studying for years at university, with multiple degrees and only a taxi driver job at the end of it. In Australia, wealthy business people have also decided that millennials should be the first generation to be forced to compete with third world labor within Australia itself. They have also decided that their children should compete for houses against many wealthy foreigners that have invested and laundered money into the country. Now, imagine for just a moment that you owned a money printing machine. You couldn't use the money, but you could print money and lend it out at interest, and collect all the interest as income. In the United States, this means scheming interest off $15 trillion of money supply, which is expanding every year from compound debt. And because you had a monopoly in money printing, the interest they had to pay you, had to come from new borrowed money that you printed. We will discover that this is exactly how the banking system works. This is why Henry Ford said that if the masses knew how the banking and money system worked, people would have revolution, throwing out those who parasite and skim from the productive class. Many of the younger generation may be preoccupied with opening national borders to many who despise Western culture, or endlessly pontificating on theories of white privilege, despite you being forced to sell land, housing, farms, utilities, and resources to wealthy nations that refuse to do the same for you. Your politicians and wealthy business people are literally selling your inheritance, pocketing cash, career opportunities, and personal advantages wherever they can, mostly at your expense. But it is time for you to wake up, before your generation is buried in debt so deep, that you will never be able to retire. In Sydney, Australia, property values have risen from $27,400 in 1960 to $1.1 million in 2017. This is a 4,055% increase. Wages have increased just 641%, nowhere near enough to cover the massive price increase. This is why in Sydney, dwelling prices have exploded from 4 times average weekly earnings to over 13 times. How are you going to ever retire when you still have a mountain of debt at age 60? In 2018, the United States owes $20 trillion to foreigners. Much of this to communist China. Australia is even worse per capita. Is this the triumph of capitalism that mainstream economists promised us? Don't be taken in by the mainstream economic propagandists and apologists. While middle-class jobs have collapsed in countries like the United States, with 44 million people on food stamps, this stands in contrast with the unmentionable success of communist China, which has increased its middle class by 500 million people. How is this possible? How do our smug mainstream economists explain this little inconvenient truth? If you think this is all a bit academic, consider this. After bankers had brought the whole financial world to the brink of financial collapse in the 2008 global financial crisis, after Wall Street issued hundreds of billions in fraudulent debt, they were bailed out to the tune of $33 trillion in quantitative easing bailout. No bankers went to jail in the United States or Britain, the epicenter of the collapse. Yet tiny little Iceland, with a population of just a few 100,000 people, threw out their useless, compromised politicians and jailed corrupt bankers. And here's the kicker. Iceland is now the richest nation per person, making them 8 times more wealthy than the United States. This, despite mainstream economists saying little Iceland would collapse after jailing bankers and, most importantly, nationalizing its biggest bank. Why does the lying, fake, corporate media never tell you this extraordinary economic truth? Answer: because they are corrupt and controlled by bank creditors. The economist boneheads that infest our universities, woeful central banks and treasuries that pull the levers, seem incapable of heeding an essay by the man that would come to be governor of the most important central bank of all, the U.S. Federal Reserve. As a young economist in 1966, Alan Greenspan disclosed that in the absence of a gold standard to limit the amount of debt created by bankers, the public would have their savings confiscated through inflation. In your case, mostly house price inflation. Remember, when land and house prices go up, this is because central bankers are creating too much debt. When the creation of debt greatly exceeds the increase in real output, this creates inflation, as explained by Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England. This social devastation is by design and a consequence of insatiable greed by a few that wish to spend vastly more than they produce by creating unearned asset inflation, and by those who wish to issue as much debt as possible to increase their taking of interest payments from those who create wealth. Workers and the free market are just collateral damage from banker inflation. The shifting of wealth from the struggling productive class to indolent rent seekers is called the Cantillon effect, and is excluded from polite economic chatter by the bought and paid for financial media drones. The price of a house is mostly driven by just 3 factors: the supply of land, the number of people, and most importantly, the amount of debt created in an economy. While the supply of land and people tends to be quite slow growing, maybe 1 or 2% a year, the amount of debt created by bankers in a year can be explosive. Think 20% per year. Even worse than the United States, Australia is the most in debt per capita nation in the world. Its half-wit central bankers allowed debt growth in excess of 20% per annum, twice, in the decade after year 2000. That despite the economy growing only a few percent per year. It is this debt growth that has made the Millenials' biggest and most important cost, a house, so absurdly expensive. It is housing costs that are crushing your budgets and is one of the key reasons why couples are delaying childbirth, later and later. And if you don't do something about it, you are encouraging the chains of your own debt slavery. Do you think this is an exaggeration? President of the Bank of England and then the second richest man in Britain, Josiah Stamp said, "If you wish to remain slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create deposits. So if a man of the political gravitas of Josiah Stamp could admit this, why can't the chimpanzees in our central bank, and elected leaders who take an oath to serve the people, just tell the truth? Sadly, the very few with the intellect and prescience to know, are making too much money off you, to tell you the shocking truth. The rest are just sycophants, unwitting propagandists, and ignorant rent-seeking apologists. They are the corporate media, politicians, and so-called economists that run your blighted inflation-ridden country. You are about to discover that most of the politicians that claim to stand for the free market, ignorantly do the opposite. They are the ones who protect financial parasites in their extraction of maximum profits from wealth creators. In Australia, we had a right-wing Prime Minister attempt to prevent a royal commission into the systemic fraud and misconduct on the community by bankers. What kind of politician is this? We had a central banker pretend to be a Christian. Even though Jesus only used violence once, when chasing the money lenders from the temple. So why do government economists allow very rapid growth in housing debt to progressively price out younger and younger generations from owning a house, preventing financial self-sufficiency? I have worked with these economists and most are unable to think at a deeply fundamental level, beyond the economic propaganda they've been fed at their universities that just assume that the structure of the money system is a given. Besides, thinking about something that might change the world for the better, will just give them less time to make more money or pursue their careers. To understand the power behind the destruction of millennials and the gutting of the Western middle class, think about the unparalleled profits from creating debt. The average wage slave has hardly any clue about the massive profits from banking. Profits that you pay for. For example, in Sydney, Australia, if you study hard at university, say for 5 years and become something productive and important like a cancer medical researcher, after 35 years of work you may have a few $100,000 in assets. Compare this to a bank. If you walk in and wish to borrow $1.1 million for an average Sydney house, over a 35-year working life, you will pay back the $1.1 million and an additional $1.2 million in interest payments. So the bank has earned an income of $1.2 million for a few hours' work, considerably more than someone working 35 years, getting up every day to produce a valuable good or service. What would you rather be, a worker that produces something for 35 years or someone sitting behind a desk issuing debt and collecting interest for decades? Remember, when the bank gives you a loan for $1.1 million, they are not borrowing it from anywhere. They just type 1.1 million into a computer, crediting your account. No gold or even paper currency change hands. But it gets much worse. Understandably, the public naively and 99.99% of economic incompetents believe that most this $1.2 million of interest payments will go to depositors. But the shocking truth is that banks create new loans first. Deposits arise from the remaining portion that is unspent or uninvested by the borrower. Did you get that? Despite the propaganda you have been told, banks do not lend money from existing deposits but create new loans and subsequently new deposits, from the remainder of loans that are not spent. Banks then charge interest on the new loans they have created. So the worker that gives up 35 years of their life to save, maybe, a few $100,000 after a working lifetime, earns less than a bank, which creates a new loan out of nothing, and proceeds to recoup $1.2 million in interest from this new loan over the years of repayment. The bank earned this $1.2 million all for a few hours of paper shuffling, gathering what is called a promissory note, a promise to pay by the hapless borrower. This is the essence of the modern central banking scam that supports trading banks. Instead of being relegated to the realm of shadowy conspiracy theory by mainstream economic apologists, this startling truth is starting to go mainstream. For example, on March 18, 2014, The Guardian magazine posted a shocking article, entitled "The Truth is Out, Money is Just an IOU and the Banks Are Rolling in It." This article quotes the oldest central bank in the world, the Bank of England, who admitted that the founding myths of neoclassical mainstream economics are wrong. And all the academic economists, market economists, TV bubbleheads, government advisors and supposed free market spivs, were wrong. Absolutely wrong. This Guardian magazine article revealed that banks do not lend money from your deposits. Something that has been assumed by the public and economists for over 100 years. They discovered that central bankers allow banks to create money, a portion of which become public deposits. Even the publication by the U.S. Central Bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve, admitted this process in its publication, Modern Money Mechanics. No wonder they withdrew the publication. Now this has finally been recognized by academic economists such as economics professor Richard Werner, over 100 years late. Better late than never. Why is all this vital for your standard of living? Think about it. If bankers are creating all this debt and if older generations use all this debt to front-run the purchase of land, making land scarce for future generations, forcing up prices, then this inevitably lead to a collapse in living standards for young families. Combine this with mass immigration that puts even more upward inflationary pressure on land and housing prices, and you have a vicious quality of life destroying policy cocktail. In Australia we have a politician, a social crusader, that owns 14 properties. Needless to say, he is doing his best to force up prices for the young. Appearances with politicians and economists are often not what they appear, and are often the polar opposite of the truth. Mainstream economists study an elementary, outdated formula by famous economist, John Maynard Keynes. It says that economic activity or gross domestic product can be calculated by adding expenditure within an economy, adding consumption, investment, government spending, exports, and subtracting imports. While this is not unreasonable, our sophisticated mainstream economists ignores the most critical factor that underpins some of these very expenditures. Incredibly, they ignore debt. Let's follow through what all this means. So if consumption or investment rise, then GDP will also rise in proportion. Mindless drone politicians are happy and they report to the naive public that GDP increased, and that the economy is getting stronger. Even when working people know that things are really getting tougher despite claims from politicians. But here's the thing. If consumption or investment rise, for example, because central bankers slashed interest rates, simply encouraging more people to spend money from new debt, then this will be treated in exactly the same way as people and businesses, saving money first from wealth creation, and then consuming and investing. What's the difference? In the first case, consumers and businesses are left with debts which they will need to pay interest on, and eventually have to pay off. This can drag on for years, and for housing loans decades. However, if consumption or investment comes from the profits of producing something, there is no debt to pay off. Politicians and economists are incapable of understanding the difference between borrowed liquidity and earned liquidity. When I asked a former head of the Australian Treasury if he understood the difference between borrowed liquidity and earned liquidity in front of 200 of our corporate elite that were sipping wine and fine dining, he stood there like a stunned mullet. The room fell silent as our best corporate brains and chief executive officers failed to understand what was being asked. Nothing. So do you know how much notice central bankers and politicians take if economic expenditures are the result of an orgy of new borrowing and speculation, even if it just wasted on foreign consumer products that end up as landfill, or on the reckless bidding up of housing prices? The answer is, virtually none. Even if the wealth of the population is going backwards, selling assets and taking on unsustainable debts, if this adds to spending and investment, boosting temporary economic growth, politicians, treasury hacks and the comic central banks will officially report things are fine, because, wait for it, the economy is growing and GDP went up. In mainstream economics, the focus is idiotically entirely focused on expenditure within an economy, not unsustainable debt and selling assets, that may be driving this expenditure. In fact, expenditure financed by debt is treated by permissive mainstream economists in the US, Australia and UK, as the same as creating something, like an automobile, aircraft, or millions of mobile phones. As long as GDP goes up, the illusion of prosperity is maintained. You can't make this stuff up. But it's what the finest academic institutions like Harvard and the London School of Economics teach. Complete academic drivel permeates every core of their economic faculties, supine to the Washington consensus model that has made the United States the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world as she rapidly deindustrialized as with the rise of the financial parasite class. Incidentally, if you get a chart of debt growth and overlay this with housing prices, they are a very close match. There is no doubt. Debt growth is the primary driver of housing prices. One of the tools of our incompetent mainstream central bankers is a well-known party trick they use to fake economic growth. It's called the wealth effect. This means encouraging more debt by the punters to drive up house prices, so they feel wealthier. This then causes them to spend more money, temporarily increasing economic activity as the debt of more recent borrowers funds the consumption habits of house owners. What's the flaw with this genius economic strategy used by the orthodoxy? Simple. Every bit of this wealth of homeowners is paid by future generations by higher house prices. So this wealth effect is an illusion because it is just a transfer or wealth from young generations that don't own housing to older generations that do. The net effect wealth effect is zero. But it's worse than this, because for failed fiscal nations like the US, Australia and UK, the primary driver is again, debt, which is passed from older to younger generations. Older citizens spend this new house price increase on foreign imports, like luxury German cars or extravagant overseas holidays, but the debt remains with the younger generations that were encouraged to take out the mountainous debt for a dwindling housing stock. Pure genius from our woeful mainstream so-called free market economists and central bankers. Meanwhile, commercial bankers make a financial killing as national debts explode, transferring wealth from the young and productive class to those with the exorbitant privilege of being able to create compounding debt and live off the mountain of interest payments as they press more and more debt into an economy, driving up prices. Interestingly, the economics profession once drew a sharp distinction between wealth creation and what is called rent-seeking. Rent-seeking is essentially collecting money while producing little or nothing in return. Rent-seekers include people such as divorce lawyers that encourage infighting to maximize their own payout from marriage breakdowns. Needless to say, if a nation is mostly comprised of rent-seekers, the creation of real things atrophies, and the nation becomes poorer as less real goods and valuable services are produced. In Australia we had an ignorant ex-treasurer who said if people wanted housing, they should get a better job. Unfortunately, he didn't have the IQ to understand that this just displaces a poorer person from their home as the rich prices them out of the market. Germans and Japanese are wealth producers, while the British are notorious rent seekers. In general, true economists detest rent seeking because it means pocketing monopoly profits from someone else who has to work. Is it not therefore unbelievable that bankers are allowed by government to create money out of nothing then charge the community interest for decades? Worse, they are able to pyramid national debts and interest. This is the very definition of rent-seeking, collecting money for producing nothing, and then compounding this debt ad infinitum. In Australia, the banks are so comical that in the 2018 Banking Royal Commission, banks admitted that they don't even check customer expenses against the bank statements, in assessing loan affordability. So, the bank just creates loans and charges interest against the community because of monopoly credit creating powers issued by government. Little else, other than taking security over assets of producers in addition to creating debt. Will the real economists please stand up to this debt rent seeking? Although the average mainstream economist will be uncomfortable with information that destroys the worldview, and may wish to simply reject it as conspiracy theory, they should note something extraordinary. In 2018, the second richest people in the world, the Swiss, voted on the introduction of sovereign money. This would prevent private banks pyramiding national credit and raking in untold billions in interest from their debt rent-seeking activities. If you ever want to confuse a mainstream economist, just ask them a simple question. Namely, if the function of banks is mainly to create debts, Will a bank be better off with more banks and debt, or less? Watch the confusion reign. Without exaggeration, we have just unraveled the foundational myth of mainstream economics that masquerades by the ill-informed as free market. Banks are monopoly or oligopoly rent seekers that live off wealth producers. In the case of the fading Australian dream, banks are now 40% of the stock exchange, parasiting off the other 60% that are wealth creators. This is the divide between the licensed debt creators and everyone else that sell their labor to produce valuable goods and services. This is a transfer from the wealth producers to those that simply have been granted a government quasi-monopoly to produce debt. When you have 40% of the capitalized stock market, owned mostly by the 1%, that live off the remaining 60% of the stock market, you get what we have right now. Land, housing, and interest payments that are so costly, that they drive up the cost of everything else in an economy, leading to deindustrialization and a collapse of the middle class, as wages fail to keep up with land and house price inflation. This is the hidden reason for the collapse of the middle class in the West, with the population polarizing to a few wealth financial rent seekers and an army of working poor that are burdened by massive debts to support their ever more modest land and dwelling purchases. Why are the so-called free market spookers not utterly outraged? Is it not utterly ironic that those who claim to be defenders of the free market are in fact the greatest supporters of the pilfering of wealth from these free markets by debt rent seekers? Unbelievably, the right wing of politics in their ignorance are the greatest defenders of this anti-free market activity. Do you think this is all an accident? Where do millennials fit into all this? The answer is, nowhere. Politicians don't care about you. They don't care your plummeting housing affordability or that you are the first generation to drown with massive student and housing debts. In Australia, all three of the most significant political parties support one of the largest per capita mass immigration programs in the world, despite this triggering an avalanche of debt and house price speculation as older generations seek to profit from this mass human influx. There is certainly no concern for the impact this mass immigration is having on stratospheric housing prices, environmental degradation, extinct species, lost arable land, depleted water resources, collapsing ecosystems, crushing traffic, overwhelmed public transport or carbon footprint. This mass immigration program is supported by both the greedy extreme right wing and the fake left wing. So millennials, forget your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram or Snapchat. Don't worry about how many likes you get. These are deliberate distractions. Stand up for your lives and your families. Understand that if you cannot afford to pay off a dwelling, you will be in debt to bankers or renting to landlords for life. You will be caught in the rent seeker's snare. You may never be able to retire, forced to work until old age overtakes you, paying debts on your deathbed. Wake up. Stand up. Get your life back. Refuse to vote for any political leader or party that does not work to make shelter affordable for young families. Follow the richest nation in the world, Iceland, and nationalize the banks. So that at the very least, their vast profits on Ponzi interest takings, go back to the community rather than unproductive, indolent rent seekers. Good luck. The future is in your hands.